So, Wessel, you ready, Gary? Yeah? So, Wessel, over to you. You've got about half an hour to... and thank you. So, for those of you who haven't been here before, we have a 30-minute talk, a brief public session where anybody can ask any questions they like, and then the examiners remain behind with the candidate and supervisors, and then that's a closed session. We then ask Wessel to leave the room while we ponder our decision, and then we make a decision and ask you back, and then the whole thing is finished. Mm-hmm. So
please let me know when I'm running towards the end. So
yeah. How many? You've probably got numbers on your slides, have you?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're looking like you're taking too long, I'll speed you up.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. So I guess we can start?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming here, first of all, on this very sunny day in a very dark room. It's going to be quite an unusual transfer talk, I suppose, for a School of Computing. But I'll try to reduce the philosophical acrobatics to the minimum, trying to be as straightforward as possible. So today I'm going to talk with you about the topic, practicing narrative virtue ethics of technology in research and innovation. Now, this might sound very unfamiliar to you right now, but hopefully in the end of the talk I will have clarified what I mean with this title. So first, a very little bit of background. Technologies are playing an increasingly pervasive role in our everyday lives and in society in general, and these impacts of technologies are very diverse. So on the one hand, you have very everyday impacts where we conduct conversations more and more through social media, for example, but on the other hand, you also have impacts, for example, on the military field, where drones are changing the face of modern warfare. So these are very different impacts. But what can be said is that any kind of emerging technology brings with it some kind of ethical implications. And since these technologies are being developed in a research and innovation context, there is a need for ethical reflection within these research and innovation processes. And the aim of my talk is related to this. I'm going to look at how to organize this practicing of ethics in research and innovation, and I will do so by proposing a novel method. So this is the structure of my talk. It's quite straightforward. Basically, first of all, I'm going to talk about existing methods at this moment, and I'm going to analyze them. That's the first research question, basically. The second question revolves around formulating a criticism of these existing methods and coming up with recommendations and following therefrom certain requirements for the construction of a novel method. And finally, I'm going to engage in the actual structuring or constructing of a novel method, and I'm going to show how this method can apply to concrete research and innovation practices. So that's kind of the structure of my talk. So to start with the first research question, I basically use three steps here. First of all, I use a certain method for literature selection. Then I'll discuss the research, the results of my literature review, and finally I'll formulate an analysis of what I call the established methods for practicing ethics in research and innovation. So I use a very straightforward method. I first of all conduct a number of queries on three main scientific databases, and I look at the bibliographies of useful sources to select a number of other sources that were useful. So I came up with eventually 101 sources that I analyzed. And from these, I selected what I call the established methods, so methods that are discussed in the scientific literature by multiple authors and that I use in multiple sources. And I found 10 of them in total. So these are the current methods that are prevalent for structuring the practicing of ethics in research and innovation. I won't go through all of them, but I will just illustrate one of them, namely the value-sensitive design method, to give you an idea of what it looks like. So the value-sensitive design method revolves around three distinct steps. First of all, ethicists engage in conceptual investigations. That basically means that they're trying to find working definitions of certain human values. And at the moment, one prominent value in this regard is, for example, privacy. So people trying to define privacy in a way that can be applied to actual design, technological design. Second of all, there are empirical investigations where ethicists and social scientists look at how different stakeholders appropriate these human values. And third of all, there are technical investigations where people look at how these values, as appropriated by different stakeholders, can be embedded in technology design. So this is only one example of the existing methods. I also conducted a more general analysis to see what kind of common traits are present throughout these different methods that I analyzed. And first of all, they mostly share certain procedural steps. So they list and conceptualize ethical values and principles in most of the cases. Then they also engage in a certain empirical analysis of relevant ethical issues. And then finally, they also organize a participatory process in which different stakeholders can give their views on what certain values, for example, mean to them. Then, second of all, there are different types of targeted uses of these kind of methods. The most prevalent one is methods that are being designed for ethicists, but also increasingly people are focusing on researchers and designers to have them participate in the process of ethical reflection. Then there are managers or policymakers that are trying to organize the practicing of ethics in research contexts. And then there are also the group of social scientists that usually try to engage in empirical investigations of, for example, what kind of values different stakeholders appropriate. And third of all, I looked at the distinct positions of each of these methods with regards to the research and innovation process. And what I mean by this is that some methods are mostly focusing on anticipating ethical issues early on in the design process, which I call ex-ante methods. Then there are methods that are directly engaging in the design of concrete applications, such as the value-sensitive design method, which I call intra methods. And then there are certain methods that are mostly reactionary, or reactive, so to say. So they first wait until a problem occurs, and then they start analyzing it, which I call exposed methods. So this is a very broad analysis of the existing methods. Secondly, I engaged in formulating a criticism of these methods, coming to certain recommendations, and then finally also formulating certain requirements that will feed into my own methods as the third part of my work. So I won't go through all these criticisms, but first of all, I structured them according to 5 prevalent challenges that are mentioned in the literature concerning the practice of practicing ethics in research and innovation, and I will just mention 2 of them. First of all, there's the challenge of uncertainty. This challenge basically revolves around the problem that whenever we try to ethically reflect on design that's in its infancy, then we have to somehow predict the future. So we somehow have to look into the future and stipulate what kind of ethical consequences we can expect. And the basic problem, or the basic criticism I raise against the current methods is that they basically assume that this is possible in principle. So in principle, that we can predict the future in a meaningful way. And I therefore against that, I argue that because of the increasing complexity of technological change, certain consequences cannot be meaningfully predicted. So we have to do something with that problem. Then I also looked at what I call ethical technology design. So I already introduced that in the context of value-sensitive design. So the problem here is the question, how can we actually embed certain human values or principles in design? There is no real answer given there by the existing literature. So they kind of assume that this is something that happens. Values are assumed to be embedded in technology design, but how this really happens, what kind of process underlies this assumption is left out of the picture. So that is a criticism I raised there. Going towards the recommendations, I also connect only the recommendations towards the two challenges that I just mentioned. So with regards to uncertainty, I recommend that there should be some kind of consideration of limitations of foresight. So not everything with regards to technological change is predictable. And then there should also be a consideration of balancing two different focuses in the field of applied ethics. On the one hand, we can still look at actions, so at actual occurrences, at consequences of technological change. But on the other hand, we should also look at the acting agent. So for example, what does it mean to be a good engineer or a good user of a certain technology? And I will come back to that in a bit. Then also with regards to technology design, I formulated a recommendation, and this recommendation basically involves this consideration that we have to give an account of how values or principles or virtues can actually be embedded in technology design. And I frame it as we need a certain account of technological mediation, so an account of how technologies mediate human morality. And from these challenges and recommendations, I come to certain requirements, and these are choices with regards to how I tackle the challenges that I want to incorporate in the eventual method. So with regards to uncertainty, I chose to adopt the framework of virtue ethics, which deals with, which mostly focuses on the agent rather than on consequences of actions. With regards to participation, so the organization of participation in practicing ethics, I adopt a framework of the philosopher Philip Bray, who stipulates distinct stages in which participation can be organized, according to which participation can be organized. Then with regards to ethical technology design, I introduce a new approach with regards to technological mediation, which I frame narrative technologies. I will explain this in the next part of the talk. And then with regard to the identification of ethical issues, I propose a concrete tool that can be used in research settings, which is called the ethics canvas, where researchers can collaboratively discuss certain narratives, structures with regards to the ethical consequences of their work, the ethical impact of their work. And finally, with regards to the evaluation of ethical issues, I propose a redesign basically of the value-sensitive design method, where I don't focus on on certain human values or principles, but rather I focus on certain virtues. So there I ask the question, how does the design of technology impact our virtues? So basically, this is the groundwork for the third part of my work, in which I actually construct this novel method. And I will go through 3 steps here. First of all, I will shortly introduce virtue ethics. Then I will go into the account of technological mediation, which is captured by narrative technologies. And then I will also show how this can be practically applied in research settings. So what is virtue ethics? Basically, virtue ethics doesn't focus, as for example utilitarian ethics, on the consequences of action. So it doesn't ask the question what constitutes either a right or a wrong action, but rather it looks at the agent. So that it basically asks what constitutes a good or a bad person. And here there are certain premises that underlie this approach. It kind of stipulates that people have basic character traits. And in common language we would say that a person can be honest, friendly, just, and these denote certain virtues, which then are these character traits. And these character traits allow people to act rightly in distinct circumstances. And second of all, these character traits or virtues are not naturally given, but they can be cultivated through education, but also more generally through the engagement in practices. And that is a more important thing to look at in a bit. So then we go to a certain theory underlying this idea of cultivation of the virtues, which is proposed by McIntyre. And he basically says that we cultivate our virtues through certain practices, and these practices are very diverse. A practice can be playing an instrument, it can be engaging in conversation, it can be driving a car, and but these practices themselves are not cannot be understood separate from one another. They are connected with one another through what he calls the narrative unity of a human life. So we have a certain life plan, we have a certain idea of where our life is supposed to go to, and this connects the practices into a meaningful unity. And then as well, these practices and this narrative unity of human life is placed within a moral community, which basically means that, for example, a Christian moral community or a Buddhist moral community have distinct ideas of what it means to lead a good life, and also have distinct ideas of what kind of practices contribute to this good life. So this approach has been recently introduced in the field of ethics of technology by Shannon Veller, and she thereby solves two main problems in the field. First of all, she accounts for this problem of uncertainty or unpredictability by not looking at how we can predict technological change, but rather looking at how people are able to cope with technological change. So how we can cultivate our character to deal with an uncertain future, basically. And second of all, she also manages to go against what is often seen as a Western bias in contemporary ethics, especially when you look at, for example, utilitarian ethics. These are very Western frameworks, whereas virtue ethics is a type of ethics that can be found in different cultures and traditions around the world. So these are kind of problems she solves. However, she does not include in her theory another requirement that I stipulated, which is basically that there should be an understanding of how technologies then in turn mediate these practices that are responsible for our virtuous character. So then I come to a different theorist, Paul Ricoeur, and I adopt his narrative theory to basically understand how technologies mediate our basic understanding of the world around us. And this revolves around a model that he stipulates as consisting of prefigured, configured, and refigured time. That sounds quite abstract, I know. I will try to illustrate it with an example. So basically, when we, for example, read a story like George Orwell's 1984, we can only engage with this story because of a pre-given social understanding or cultural understanding, linguistic understanding. That is what he designates as prefigured time. Then through the reading of the story, we gain different insights or a different understanding of, for example, what it means to live in a world where surveillance technologies are prevalent. So this is what happens in configured time. It's kind of a process of the coming about of a plot that then has an impact on our understanding of the world. And refigured time basically means that as soon as we have read this cultural artifact, our understanding of our own world has changed through engagement in this fictional world. And what we basically argue is that this process does not only happen when we read a text, but it also happens when we engage with certain technologies. And to illustrate this connection, I just give another example, very briefly. So we could ask a question, what does it mean to drive a car? So what does the practice of driving really entail? And according to Ricoeur, we go through certain layers of understanding here. We could first of all say that driving a car consists of basic actions. So changing the gear, twisting the steering wheel. But these basic actions are then logically interrelated in what he calls a chain of actions, which basically is still an analytic idea of consecutive actions, which we could conceptualize as, for example, halting in front of a traffic light. But then these chains of actions can only be understood in the context of a pre-given understanding of, for example, the traffic as such. So this is kind of what Reijer designates of the prefigured time. And these together then constitute what we call the practice of driving a car, which is a complex action, so to say. And these actions in turn then are made intelligible by means of what McIntyre designates as the unity of the narrative unity of human life, so a certain life plan. One could say, for example, that within your professional life plan, driving a car helps you from getting from work to from your house to work. But at the same time, the overarching idea of the good life can directly influence our practices. So, for example, we could gain a different understanding of what it means to live sustainably in the context of climate change, and this could directly have an impact on the underlying practice. So this might, for example, mean that we become more conscious of our driving, changing the way that we use the gas and our gears. But in the same way, it could also mean that we change our practices. It could mean that we stop driving a car and start driving a bike. So this kind of illustrates how these two theories are interrelated. Okay, now I'm going to connect the dots. Having connected, on the one hand, virtue ethics and narrative theory, I come to 4 different elements that should be included in the method for practicing ethics in research and innovation. First of all, there has to be kind of an empirical exploration of narrative structures that allow us to identify ethical issues in the first place. And these ethical issues can then be stipulated as forms of technological practice. Then we can use narrative theory to understand what these practices mean. Following by an evaluation of these practices by looking at whether they cultivate virtue or virtuous character or whether they rather obstruct it. And finally, it should include an element of engaging with these evaluations and actual research practice so that eventually something is done with them. So then I come to the final part, where we look at how this framework can actually be applied to concrete research practices. And here I use, as I've said before, I use a framework or an approach came up with by, or formulated by Philip Bry, where he uses different stages in the practicing of ethics in research and innovation to structure the participatory process, to say which kind of stakeholders should be involved in the different stages. And these are the disclosure, theoretical, and application stages. Very shortly, the disclosure stage basically means the stage at which ethical impacts are discovered or identified. The theoretical stage basically means the stage where they are conceptualized and evaluated. Then the application stage means that they are being translated into design interventions. So I will just go through these 3 stages very shortly to show how we deal with them in making this a concrete application. So first of all, looking at the disclosure stage, so how can we actually identify these narrative structures basically that point at certain ethical impacts. And we came up with the ethics canvas, for which we actually went to a totally different field, the field of business model development. Why? Because in applied ethics there are very few participatory approaches that are feasible or useful, and this one is actually widely adopted. So we basically looked at it from the we adopted the model of the business model canvas, which can be used in groups to discuss and formulate a certain business model. And we turned it around and made it into a tool that can actually be used to discuss the ethics of a certain research and innovation project. And we actually already tried this out in different classroom settings, and we also tried out within the ADEPT Center, and the first results have been pretty promising, so people actually eventually coming up with design interventions following from their evaluation or from their engagement with the ethics canvas. Then, the framework I came up with can be used for the conceptualization and evaluation of these ethical issues that are being identified. I kind of already went through that, so I will skip that for the moment. And then finally, once we got these evaluations, so we have a certain idea of how a certain technology design can impact our virtues, we come to the stage where this evaluation needs to be translated into design interventions. And this is what I call then the virtue-sensitive design method, which basically borrows from the value-sensitive design method, but instead of looking at human principles and human values, it looks at virtues and engages with these virtues in a participatory way according to what I just described as technological practices. So to wrap up, this is basically what I discussed today. First of all, I looked at the different methods that are out there, I analyzed them, then I formulated a criticism, followed by recommendations for constructing a novel method, and then finally going towards requirements for the method that I eventually intend to design. And this resulted then in the connection between two different approaches, virtue ethics and narrative theory, eventually culminating in concrete applications in actual research context. So, also just to wrap up, how did I deal with the different challenges? I dealt with the issue of uncertainty by introducing the virtue ethics approach. I dealt with the issue of participation by including Philip Bryce's considerations with regards to participation in different stages of ethical practicing ethics. Then I included a narrative theory to understand the idea of technological mediation. I used the ethics canvas to identify ethical issues, and I proposed a virtue-sensitive design method to eventually come to design interventions. So this is kind of the remainder of my work towards my dissertation, and here are a couple of publications that came out of the work so far. And then the only thing that rests for me to do is thanking you for your attention, and hopefully you have some challenging questions.
Okay, thanks, Wessel. Okay, so as I say, the first part of the presentation is now open to the public for anybody to ask any questions or comments on anything they've heard from Wessel. I mean, maybe you can take us through the time plan in a little bit more detail, because you went through that very quickly. There's still plenty of time. So what are the main challenges still to overcome?
So the main challenges, the most prominent challenge is the development of the virtue-sensitive design approach, which I haven't really got into yet. Yeah. So that is going to be the main challenge, also with regards, because it includes participatory processes, and I have to look at to what extent I can actually engage with those. So that is still a big part. Another part is the actual connection between virtue ethics and narrative theory, which I have already gone into, but which is still in development. So that is something that will hopefully be finished in the next half year, and then there is also the issue of further testing the ethics canvas. So I hope to find more groups with whom, and maybe also online people that would like to help develop it online or to test it online. So those are basically the main issues that are still need to be tackled. Go ahead.
Could you apply the kind of framework to retroactively to something that's already developed, but that you're kind of evolving as well?
Yeah, what we did ourselves. So In the papers I wrote, I usually focus on a specific case, and the case that I mostly focus on was cryptocurrencies and blockchain technologies, which is kind of an interesting area because it's both really in development, but it also has concrete applications. So there we used this narrative theory to more or less make explicit how the use of these technologies can shape our social practices.
And do kind of like specific requirements of a system come out of the ethics that you identify, or is it just to actually think about them? Or?
Well, eventually the idea is that it should not be a very prescriptive approach, and that's also kind of the whole rationale of my work, where in the background I kind of react against the current organization of ethics in academia or in research in general, where it's mostly kind of a policing task, where you as a researcher have to write certain ethics clearance forms and such, have to engage in some kind of bureaucracy to make sure that you meet certain requirements, which in itself is important, but on the other hand, it also negates the idea of ethics in the sense of taking your own responsibility in dealing with certain issues. So I kind of approach it from another perspective. So eventually, it is not the idea that certain prescriptions follow from the approach, but rather that it structures a certain decision-making process where multiple people are involved, from which design interventions can be formulated. But they shouldn't come from the outside, so to say.
So it's more just to identify things to think about while you're designing stuff, kind of.
Yeah, but then eventually, like, so the last step, which is still very much in progress, which is the virtue-sensitive design idea, should eventually lead to actual design changes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, okay. No worries.
I think that's an interesting discussion. You know, so it's all very well saying, okay, we don't want this to be prescriptive, but you know, if the ethics canvas is a tool by which you can foresee some ethical problems that might come down the line, you know, you want to be able to then see at the end of this, you know, were those avoided? You know, can you use the ethics canvas then to test whether the problems that you foresaw were successfully circumvented?
Yeah. So one of the parts of the canvas now is actually already an intervention exercise, which merely is there for people to already formulate some initial ideas, which is then this idea of resolving ethical impacts. And people already came up with ideas so these were the student groups that we tested the canvas with, that were all developing an application in their classes, and there they kind of had to engage in the discussions of, okay, we kind of now know what kind of problems we have to face, so how are we going to deal with those? And there were ideas formulated there, but those are quite initial, so they, especially in more complex projects, I think that it will need much further deliberation before real decisions can be made.
Okay, any more questions or comments from the general session? Okay, if not, then let's thank Wessel again. Well done.
Thank you.
So I'll just ask